London does not sleep in the way other cities do. It drifts, submerged under a heavy silken tide of October fog. Somewhere in the distance, a lighthouse on a jagged coast flickers. But here, inside the sanctuary of Baker Street, the world has narrowed down to the amber glow of a dying fire and a mystery that was never meant to be told. Tonight, we are not looking for a criminal, but for the truth behind a lantern that burns with a light that should not exist. Listen to the silence of the room. It is a heavy, comforting weight, broken only by the rhythmic sigh of the wind against the glass and the faint, woodsy scent of old books and cooling tea. Sherlock Holmes sits across from me, a shadow among shadows, his eyes reflecting the embers as he contemplates a riddle brought to us by a woman dressed in the velvet black of morning. You are safe here, anchored in this moment of Victorian stillness, as we begin a journey that will take us far from the gaslight of the city to the salt-sprayed cliffs of Dorset. The fog is closing in, the fire is warm, and the story is about to unfold. The atmosphere of our sitting room at 221B has a soul of its own. It is a cathedral of quietude, where time loses its edge. Every creak of the floorboards under Mrs. Hudson's distant footsteps feels like a heartbeat, steady and slow. Outside, the muffled clatter of a passing hansom cab rises and falls like a fading memory, a temporary intrusion that only serves to deepen the profound isolation of our quarters. We are cocooned in a world of Moroccan leather and the sharp, clean tang of chemical salts, a place where the chaos of the British Empire cannot reach. I watch the silhouette of my friend. Holmes is a study in absolute stillness, his sharp features softened by the gloom, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. He is waiting, not for the door to open, but for the mind to settle, for the static of the day to wash away until only the essential truth remains. There is a particular kind of peace found in these hours, a heavy-laden tranquility that invites the mind to drift into the gray spaces of the map. ... The walls, lined with the dark, weathered spines of forgotten chronicles, seem to retreat into the velvet dark. We are suspended in a moment of perfect equilibrium. The fog presses against the window pane, a soft and insistent weight, reminding us that while the streets may be lost to the mist, here, within this circle of lamplight, there is a clarity that transcends the visual. The light filtering through the heavy drapes is a pale, ghostly silver, offering no warmth but a gentle, steady illumination that honors the dust motes dancing in the air. Somewhere, a church bell tolls, low, resonant, and rounded by the density of the cold air. It is the sound of the world turning, yet here, we remain anchored in a beautiful, somber stasis. The silence is a vessel, waiting to be filled with the weight of the sea, the smell of ancient stone, and the flickering light of a widow's lantern. The hearth continues to crackle, a small, rhythmic punctuation to the stillness. Each pop of the burning coal is like a tiny star collapsing in the dark. We have spent many such mornings in this state of shared reflection, where words are unnecessary, and the presence of a trusted companion is the only comfort required. The air carries the faint remnants of a breakfast long finished, a ghost of toast and marmalade that anchors us to the domestic reality of London life, even as our thoughts begin to stray toward the wilder, more untamed corners of the coast. It is a morning of profound softness. The edges of the furniture, the sharp lines of the mantelpiece, and even the stern profile of the Persian slipper holding Holmes's tobacco, all seem to blur into a singular, cohesive piece. There is no urgency here, only the steady expansion of a narrative that has been waiting in the shadows for years. The city outside may be clamoring for attention, but within these walls, the only thing that matters is the slow, deliberate unfolding of a secret. As the fire owns itself down to a core of glowing orange, The room feels as though it is breathing with us. The shadows on the ceiling stretch and yawn, dancing to a tempo that only the weary can hear. It is the perfect threshold, a gateway between the waking world and the realm of memory. We are prepared. The mind is open, the heart is steady, and the heavy drapes of the everyday have been pulled back to reveal the silvered path of the unknown. Let the warmth of this hearth ground you. Let the shadows guide your thoughts as the morning matures into a dream. And let us prepare to leave the safety of London for the whispers of the salt and the stone. The door opened with a slow, deliberate creak, and the presence that entered our sitting room seemed to pull the very shadows in behind her. She was a woman of striking, somber elegance, shrouded in the heavy crepe and silk of deep mourning. Her movements as fluid and silent as the mist pressing against the window. In her gloved hands, she held an object that appeared entirely out of place in the heart of a metropolitan residence, a nautical lantern crafted from beaten brass and salt-pitted glass, which she clutched as if it were a sacred relic or a lifeline in a turbulent sea. She did not speak at first. She simply stood there, a dark pillar against the silver light of the morning, while the faint scent of brine and old iron began to drift through the room, mingling with the warmth of our hearth. Sherlock Holmes rose from his chair, his movements lean and graceful, his keen eyes instantly dissecting every detail of our visitor's appearance. He did not rush to greet her, understanding that such a profound silence required a matching stillness. He observed the way her fingers trembled slightly against the brass frame of the lantern, the faint dusting of white chalk on the hem of her cloak, and the hollow exhaustion etched into the lines of her pale face. To any other observer, she was merely a widow in distress, but to Holmes, she was a walking map of a distant wind-swept coastline, bringing with her a problem that defied the logical boundaries of the city. The lantern itself was a curiosity of craftsmanship. It was not the mass-produced equipment of a London quay, but a bespoke vessel, engraved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when the firelight caught them. It was cold, yet the glass was clouded with a persistent, internal heat that suggested it had recently been lit by a flame of unusual intensity. As she finally moved toward the table, the rustle of her skirts sounded like the receding tide over shingle. She placed the lantern down with a heavy thud, and for a moment, the three of us simply stared at it, a silent, metallic witness to a fear that had no name. Holmes leaned forward, his long shadow stretching across the floorboards to touch the hem of her garment. He spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, a tone designed to soothe the frayed nerves of a person who had spent too many nights watching the dark. He noted the salt air that clung to her woolens and the specific wear on her boots, concluding, without a word spoken, that she had traveled through the night from the rugged edges of Dorset. The woman, Mrs. Marrow, sank into the armchair we offered, her strength appearing to evaporate the moment she relinquished her hold on the brass handle. She looked at us with eyes that had seen something the mind struggled to reconcile with reality, a flickering light in a windowless room, a glow that persisted long after the oil had run dry. In this sanctuary of Baker Street, the arrival of such an artifact felt like a breach in the fabric of the everyday. We were surrounded by the tools of reason microscopes, reference books, and the orderly records of past crimes. Yet the lantern sat in our midst, like an ancient, irrational heart. The light of the fire reflected in its glass panes, creating distorted miniatures of the room that seemed to vibrate with a life of their own. Every detail of the scene was amplified by the quiet, the rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock, the distant muffled calls of the street, and the heavy expectant atmosphere that always preceded one of Holmes's great descents into the unknown. Mrs. Marrow began to peel back her gloves, revealing skin as translucent as porcelain. She spoke of her home, a lonely estate, perched on the crumbling limestone cliffs where the wind never truly stops its mourning. She described the lantern not as a tool, but as a burden passed down through a lineage of women who had all died with their eyes turned toward the sea. It was a story of inheritance and haunting, of a light that appeared in her hallway at midnight, even when the wick was trimmed and the oil reservoir was empty. As she spoke, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners deepening into the bruised purple of a storm-tossed horizon. Holmes listened with an intensity that was almost physical, his spirit seemingly leaving the room to walk the jagged paths she described. He was fascinated not by the ghost stories, but by the physical impossibility of the light. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering just an inch from the cold brass, tracing the geometry of the engravings without touching them. He was searching for the mechanism of the mystery, the hidden spring or the chemical secret that could turn a simple lamp into a vessel of terror. The tension in the room was not one of fear, but of a profound intellectual immersion, a shared journey into the mechanics of the uncanny. The fire in the hearth shifted, a log breaking apart into a bed of glowing embers, and for a brief second, the lantern seemed to pulse in response. It was a soft, rhythmic throb, like the glow of a deep-sea creature in the abyss. Mrs. Merrow flinched, her breath catching in her throat. But Holmes remained unshaken. He was an anchor in the rising tide of her narrative, a steady point of logic in a sea of superstition. We sat there in the waning light of the morning, three souls bound together by a piece of tarnished metal, and the weight of a secret that had finally traveled far enough to find the one man who could dismantle it. The journey had begun, not with a gallop of horses or the flash of a blade, but with the silent, steady gaze of a detective and the heavy, salt-stained presence of a widow's lantern. The voice of Isa Merrow was like the sound of shifting sand, dry and rhythmic, carrying the weight of a woman who had lived too long in the company of ghosts and the relentless sea. She sat perfectly still in the velvet armchair, her pale hands resting near the brass lantern, as if drawing a cold sort of comfort from its presence. She began to speak of her home, a place called Hemsley, a manor that stood like a jagged tooth upon the limestone cliffs of Dorset. It was a house defined by the wind, a structure of salt-eaten stone where the windows rattled in their frames like teeth, and the corridors held the chill of the Atlantic even in the height of summer. She described a life of profound isolation, a world where the only neighbors were the screaming gulls and the rhythmic pounding pulse of the tide against the rocks below. Her husband had been a man of the sea, a captain who had vanished into the gray horizon years ago, leaving her with nothing but the estate and this singular heavy artifact. The lantern, she explained, was not merely a family heirloom, but a sentinel. For generations, the women of her line had been tasked with a strange and silent ritual. Every night, as the sun dipped below the jagged edge of the world, they were to place the lantern in the high window of the attic, facing the black expanse of the ocean. There was no wick to trim, no oil to replenish. The instructions passed down through the bloodline were simple yet terrifying. The light would find its own way, and when it did, one must never look directly into the heart of the flame. As Isa spoke, her eyes seemed to fix on a point far beyond the walls of Baker Street, peering into the memory of those long, lonely nights. She told us of the first time she had witnessed the phenomenon. It had been a night of absolute stillness, the kind of silence that precedes a great storm. She had gone to the attic to shutter the windows, forgetting for a moment the superstition of her ancestors. There, sitting on the dusty floorboards, the lantern began to glow. It started as a faint, rhythmic pulse, a soft violet hue that seemed to breathe in time with the ocean. There was no heat, no smoke, only a light that felt ancient and wrong, a luminescence that did not illuminate the room so much as it carved shadows into the air that should not have been there. The terror, she said, was not in the light itself, but in what the light summoned. On the nights when the lantern burned brightest, the sea outside would change. The waves would cease their chaotic crashing and begin to move in a singular, coordinated swirl, as if something immense was stirring beneath the surface, responding to the call of the brass vessel. She had heard voices, or perhaps they were merely the echoes of the wind through the sea caves, whispering names that had been erased from the parish registers centuries ago. Her health had begun to fail, her sleep haunted by visions of a submerged city and a light that burned underwater, cold and eternal. She felt herself being pulled, inch by inch, toward the cliff's edge, as if the lantern were a tether connecting her soul to the abyss. Sherlock Holmes remained motionless, his chin resting on his steepled fingers, absorbing every syllable of her haunting narrative. He did not interrupt her with the cold skepticism of a man of science. Instead, he watched the way her shadow flickered against the bookshelf, noting the sincerity of her fear. This was not the rambling of a mind undone by grief, but the testimony of a witness to something that defied the known laws of the natural world. The room felt smaller now, the warmth of our fire seeming to retreat in the face of the damp coastal dread she had brought into our sanctuary. Isa Marrow leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely reached my ears. She confessed that she had tried to destroy the lantern once. She had taken a heavy smith's hammer to the glass, but the metal had not dented, and the glass had not scratched. She had tried to cast it into the sea, but the next morning she had found it sitting on her doorstep, bone dry and cold, with a faint trail of salt leading back to the cliffs. It was then she realized that she was not the owner of the lantern, but its prisoner. She had come to London not for an exorcism, but for a mind that could look at the impossible and find the thread of reason hidden within the madness. We sat in a long silence after she finished, the weight of her story settling into the corners of the room like dust. I could almost hear the distant roar of the Dorset surf and feel the spray of the salt air against my skin. The city of London, with its gaslight and its crowds, felt like a fragile illusion compared to the primal, shifting darkness Isa described. Holmes finally moved, reaching out a long, thin finger to trace the engraved symbols on the lantern's base once more. His eyes were bright with a predatory intelligence, the look of a man who had finally found a riddle worthy of his time. The widow's tale was a map of a nightmare, and as the morning light grew pale and thin, I realized that we were already standing on the threshold of a journey from which there might be no quiet return. The night mail train to Dorset began not with a movement, but with a transformation of the world into a rhythmic, mechanical dream. As we stepped onto the platform of Waterloo Station, the iron ribs of the great glass ceiling were lost in a swirling vortex of steam and soot, illuminated by the harsh white glare of the electric lamps. The air here was a different entity altogether from the stagnant mist of Baker Street. It was charged with the smell of coal smoke, hot oil, and the restless energy of 1,000 departures. Holmes walked ahead of me, his long ulster coat billowing behind him like the wings of a nocturnal bird, his silhouette sharp and purposeful against the shifting clouds of white vapor. We found our carriage, a private compartment lined with faded blue velvet and smelling faintly of stale tobacco and winter rain. And as we settled into the plush seats, the heavy doors slammed shut with a finality that signaled the end of the city and the beginning of the void. The departure was a slow, agonizingly beautiful crawl. The locomotive exhaled a series of deep, guttural gasps that vibrated through the floorboards and into the very soles of our boots. Slowly, the pillars of the station began to slide backward, retreating into the gloom. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels over the rail points started as a hesitant heartbeat click, click, clack, gradually gathering strength and speed until it became a hypnotic industrial mantra. London began to dissolve outside the window. The glowing yellow squares of tenement windows, the flickering gas lamps of the suburban streets, and the jagged outlines of chimney pots all blurred into a continuous ribbon of amber and gray. I watched the reflection of the compartment's small oil lamp in the glass, a solitary flame dancing against the backdrop of the rushing dark. And I felt the weight of the city falling away, replaced by the profound velvet isolation of the rails. Holmes did not speak. He had reclaimed his position of absolute stillness, his head resting against the cushioned partition, and his eyes closed, though I knew his mind was racing along the tracks far ahead of the engine. On the seat between us sat the widow's lantern, wrapped now in a heavy woolen cloth, yet even smothered in fabric, it seemed to possess a gravity that anchored the entire carriage. I found myself staring at the dark bundle, my thoughts drifting back to Mrs. Merrow's trembling hands and the impossible light she had described. The train leaned into a long, sweeping curve, and the whistle shrieked a lonely, mournful cry that tore through the silence of the sleeping countryside. It was a sound that belonged to the ghosts of the night, a warning to the living that we were trespassing into a realm where the laws of the pavement no longer applied. As the hours groaned by, the landscape outside transformed into a prehistoric tapestry of shadow. The managed forests of the home counties gave way to the rolling, desolate heaths of the south. Under the pale, watery light of a waning moon, the earth looked silvered and cold, a sea of frozen waves made of grass and stone. The repetitive motion of the train became a physical sensation of descent, as if we were being pulled deeper into the throat of a mystery that had waited centuries for a witness. I closed my eyes, but the darkness behind my eyelids was filled with the rhythmic pulse of the engine thrum, 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 a mechanical echo of the heartbeat Isa Merrow had claimed to hear within the lantern's glow. The smell of the coal smoke seeped into the carriage, bitter and ancient, reminding me of the subterranean fires that burn beneath the crust of the world. We passed through small forgotten stations, where the lamps were mere pinpricks of light in an ocean of black. These were places without names, silent platforms where no one waited and no one departed, mere ghosts in the periphery of our journey. The world had become a narrow corridor of wood and glass, hurtling through a vacuum. I thought of the history of this land, of the Roman legions who had marched across, these same Moors and the ancient mariners who had used the stars to find their way to the jagged Dorset coast. We were following in their wake, carried by steam and iron, yet seeking a truth that was far older than the industrial age. The vibration of the carriage was a constant low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate the very fluid in my ears, inducing a state of trance-like wakefulness where the boundaries between memory and imagination began to fray. I looked over at Holmes and saw that he had opened his eyes. They were fixed on the roof of the compartment, tracing invisible patterns in the shadows. He looked like a man suspended in time, a navigator of the intangible. The journey was not merely a transition of geography for him, but a calibration of the soul. He was shedding the distractions of London, the newspapers, the telegrams, the trivialities of the criminal court, and tuning his intellect to the frequency of the sea and the stone. The train began to slow as we approached the deeper ridges of the coast, the engine's breath becoming more labored, more deliberate. The scent of the air changed. The acrid bite of the coal was suddenly pierced by a sharp, cold blade of salt. It was the first breath of the Atlantic, reaching inland to greet us, a damp and bracing harbinger of the cliffs that lay ahead. The wheels groaned as the brakes were applied, a long, screeching lament that echoed off the embankments. We were entering the heart of the silence now. The rhythmic comfort of the high-speed rails was replaced by the jolting, hesitant movement of a local line. Outside, the fog was returning, not the yellow, choking smog of the city, but a clean white shroud that rose from the damp earth to meet the sea mist. It swirled against the carriage windows, seeking entry, a ghostly traveler trying to hitch a ride on our iron horse. We were almost there, at the edge of the map, where the lights of civilization were few and far between, and where a widow's lantern was the only guide through a darkness that had never truly been conquered. The journey had been a long, deliberate slide into the unknown, and as the train finally came to a shuddering halt at the desolate platform of Dagger Point, the silence that rushed in to fill the void was the heaviest thing I had ever heard. The station at Dagger Point was a skeletal structure of salt-bleached timber and rusted iron, a lonely outpost, shivering under the immense weight of the coastal night. As we stepped from the warmth of the carriage, the air did not merely touch us, it invaded, a sharp, bracing lungful of Atlantic brine and damp earth that seemed to strip away the last lingering comforts of London. There was no station master to greet us, no flickering gaslight to guide our path. The world here was governed by a different set of elements, a raw and primal landscape where the limestone cliffs met the churning fury of the sea. The fog had thickened into a translucent wall, wrapping around the station's single flickering oil lamp and turning it into a ghostly, unmoored orb. Every sound was magnified by the stillness. The crunch of our boots on the wet shingle, the distant, rhythmic boom of the tide against the rocks, and the mournful cry of a disturbed lapwing rising from the marshland. We began our ascent toward the village, a path that wound like a serpent up the treacherous face of the heights. The mud was thick and clannish, clinging to our trousers as if the earth itself were trying to pull us back, to discourage us from reaching the summit. Holmes walked with a steady, rhythmic gait, his silver-topped cane striking the stones with a sound like a ticking clock, a solitary pulse of human order in a chaotic wilderness. Above us, the silhouette of the Marrow estate loomed, a jagged, lightless monolith carved from the very cliffside. It did not look like a residence of the living. It looked like a natural extension of the rock, a fortress designed to withstand the assault of the centuries. The wind here had a voice, a low, guttural moan that whistled through the gaps in the dry stone walls and carried the scent of ancient rotting kelp and cold, sunless caves. As we reached the crest of the hill, the village of Dagger Point revealed itself, a cluster of low-slung stone cottages huddled together like frightened sheep. The windows were small and dark, shuttered against the gale, and the streets were paved with uneven cobbles that glimmered like the scales of a drowned beast in the moonlight. There was a profound sense of antiquity here, a feeling that the village had remained unchanged since the days of the privateers and the wreckers. The history of this place was written in the salt-pitted doorways and the heavy iron rings bolted into the stone to tether boats against the surge. We passed a small, sagging tavern, its sign creaking on rusted hinges, the faded image of a crossed anchor barely visible beneath the grime of decade. No light spilled from its cracks, and no voices drifted from within. It was a place of deep, suspicious slumber, where the inhabitants knew better than to look out at the mist when the tide was rising. Beyond the village lay the churchyard, a desolate field of leaning slate headstones that seemed to be marching slowly toward the cliff's edge. The names carved into the stone had long since been eroded by the salt air, leaving only the faceless shapes of grief. It was here that the boundary between the land and the abyss felt most fragile. The roar of the ocean was constant now, a subterranean vibration that I felt in my chest, a reminder of the immense power that lay just a few hundred yards away, hidden by the white veil of the fog. Holmes stopped for a moment, his gaze fixed on the dark outline of the cliffs. He was reading the landscape, tracing the invisible veins of the geography, looking for the secret paths that linked the manor house to the hidden chambers of the shore. The air was so heavy with moisture that it felt as if we were walking underwater, our breath coming in slow, visible plumes that vanished into the greater gray. The silence of Dagger Point was not a lack of sound, but a presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that muffled the spirit and invited the mind to imagine horrors in the shadows. Every gnarled hawthorn tree, bent double by the prevailing winds, looked like a reaching hand. Every shadow cast by a chimney stack seemed to move of its own accord. We were outsiders in a realm that guarded its secrets with the ferocity of a predator. The widow's lantern, still tucked beneath Holmes's arm, felt like a cold coal, a piece of this landscape that we had brought back to its origin. As we approached the iron gates of the Merrow estate, the metal groaned in a long descending note, a sound that echoed through the empty streets and seemed to wake the very stones of the village. We had arrived at the edge of the world, where the history of man ended and the long, cold memory of the sea began. And as the fog swallowed the path behind us, I realized that we were now truly alone in the dark. The first night at Hemsley Manor was not a period of rest, but a long, waking immersion into a world of rhythmic shadows and impossible light. The guest wing of the house felt like the interior of a dormant cathedral, cold and vast, with ceilings that vanished into a charcoal gloom. Sherlock Holmes had declined the comfort of sleep, choosing instead to station himself by the narrow lancet window that overlooked the sheer drop of the cliffs. I sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, watching the embers of a meager peat fire struggle against the damp draught that seeped through the ancient masonry. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of the sea. Every breath I drew tasted of salt and wet stone, a persistent reminder that we were merely guests on a crumbling ledge above the abyss. As the midnight hour approached, the natural world outside seemed to hold its breath. The wind, which had been howling since our arrival, died down to a low, mournful whistle, and the constant roar of the surf became a distant, muffled thrum. It was in this sudden, unnatural pocket of silence that the first pulse occurred. I saw it not with my eyes initially, but as a strange sensation behind my eyelids, a rhythmic tightening of the air. When I looked toward the window, I saw Holmes standing perfectly still, his silhouette carved out of the darkness by a faint, bioluminescence that was rising from the jagged rocks below. It was not a beam of light, nor a flash from a lighthouse, but a slow breathing glow that seemed to emerge from the very pores of the limestone. The light was rhythmic, expanding and contracting with the deliberate pace of a great lung. Each time it brightened, the room was bathed in a hue that defied description, a bruised electric purple that made the shadows of the furniture twist and lengthen into grotesque shapes. It was a light that did not reveal the world, but rather obscured it, casting a veil of unreality over the oak panels and the dusty tapestries. I joined Holmes at the glass, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Below us, the sea had been transformed. The white foam of the breakers was gone, replaced by a swirling bioluminescent vortex that mirrored the pulses of the lantern sitting on the table behind us. The water did not move with the tides. It moved with an intelligence, a coordinated swirl that centered around a black, jagged tooth of rock known locally as the widow's Spire. Holmes's face was a mask of cold, intellectual ferocity. He was not afraid. He was calculating. He watched the pulses with a pocket watch in one hand, his thumb clicking the stop action. With mechanical precision, he noted the intervals, the duration of the glow, and the subtle shifts in the spectrum. To him, this was not a ghost or a curse, but a physical phenomenon with a hidden cause. Yet, even as he measured the light, the sheer beauty and terror of it began to work upon my mind. I felt a pull, a subtle, gravitational tug toward the window, as if the light were calling to something primal within the blood. I thought of Elias and Merrow's ancestors, the generations of women who had watched this same violet breath from this very room. And I understood then that the lantern was not just a tool, but a bridge between the solid earth and the fluid, shifting mysteries of the deep. The glow persisted for what felt like hours, though the clock on the mantel claimed only minutes had passed. It was a slow story told in light, a narrative of something buried and forgotten that was trying to find its way back to the surface. The air in the room grew thick with the smell of ozone, the sharp metallic scent that precedes a lightning strike. I found myself slipping into a state of trance-like observation, my thoughts dissolving into the rhythm of the violet pulses. I saw patterns in the swirling water, shapes that looked like the foundations of a drowned city, or the ribs of a leviathan long since turned to stone. The world of London, of logic, and of medicine felt like a dream I had once had, a fragile construction that had no place here on the edge of the Dorset cliffs. Suddenly, as quickly as it had begun, the light collapsed. It did not fade. It vanished as if a great eye had suddenly closed. The darkness that rushed back into the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blackness that felt like a physical weight upon our chests. The roar of the wind returned with a sudden, violent shriek, rattling the window panes and scattering the white ash of the fire across the rug. Holmes finally moved, his boots clicking sharply on the floor as he returned to the table. He picked up the brass lantern, which was now cold to the touch, and examined the glass with a magnifying lens. His eyes were bright with the thrill of the chase. He had seen the pattern, the hidden logic behind the haunting, and I knew that the morning would bring no rest, but a descent into the very heart of the stone from which that light had breathed. For now, the house was silent once more, but the memory of that violet pulse remained burned into my retinas, a rhythmic ghost that would haunt my dreams long after the sun rose over the gray Atlantic. The morning air at Dagger Point was a thick, translucent soup of white mist and the smell of ancient rotting kelp. Duh. Sherlock Holmes had not slept. He had spent the remaining hours of the night studying the salt crust patterns on the window pane, his mind already miles ahead of the rising sun. We broke our fast in a silence that was almost liturgical, the only sound being the rhythmic scrape of a silver spoon against a porcelain bowl. Soon after, we ventured out into the village to seek the one man who, according to the local whispers, held the keys to the town's unwritten history. We found Eli Creed at the edge of the harbor, a man who seemed more a product of the shoreline than of human parentage. His skin was the color of cured leather, mapped with 1,000 wrinkles that looked like the receding tide lines on a beach, and his eyes were a startling, milky blue, the color of a shallow sea over white sand. He was mending a drift net, his gnarled fingers moving with a hypnotic, mechanical precision that spoke of decades spent in the same repetitive motion. As we approached, he did not look up, yet he spoke as if he had been expecting our footfalls for hours. He began to tell us of the era before the lighthouses, a time when the coast was governed by the great monastic houses, and the privateers who sought refuge in the limestone cathedrals of the cliffs. The history he recounted was not found in any library in London. It was a history of blood, salt, and a light that was never meant to serve the living. He spoke of the widow's spire, that jagged tooth of rock we had seen the night before, and the ancient belief that it was a thin place, a point where the veil between the world of breath and the world of the deep was worn to a translucent thread. Eli's voice was a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to harmonize with the distant thrum of the surf. He told us that the lantern Mrs. Marrow carried was part of a triad of relics brought back from the Crusades by a knight who had lost his mind to the heat of the desert. This knight believed he had found the source of the primordial light, a substance that existed before the sun and would remain long after the stars had cooled to ash. The lantern was not a lamp, Eli whispered, but a cave It was designed to contain a fragment of the abyss, a rhythmic energy that responded to the lunar cycles and the shifting weight of the Atlantic. The women of the Marrow Line were not hauntings. They were keepers of the seal, tasked with ensuring that the light never stayed in the dark for too long, lest it begin to consume the very foundations of the land. As he spoke, the mist began to swirl around his boots, creating the illusion that he was dissolving into the gray. He described the silent trade of the 18th century, when smugglers used the violet pulses of the Spire to navigate through the sea caves without the need for torches. They had discovered that the light did not just illuminate the dark, it altered it, making the stone transparent to those who knew how to look. But the price of such knowledge was madness. One by one, the men who used the light began to hear the song of the stone, a low-frequency vibration that hummed in the marrow of their bones. They became obsessed with the hollows beneath the earth, eventually retreating into the caves to become part of the very geography they sought to exploit. Holmes stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Eli's moving hands. I could see the gears of his intellect turning, separating the folklore from the physical reality. He asked about the tunnels, the hidden veins of the cliffside that linked the manor to the sea. Eli paused then, his needle suspended in midair. He looked at us with a profound, weary sadness. He told us of the Great Void, a chamber directly beneath the widow's spire where the tides met the fresh water of the inland springs. It was there, he said, that the original keeper had been entombed with the second relic, and it was there that the light was strongest. He warned us that the stone has a memory, and that it does not like to be disturbed by the inquisitive minds of the city. The conversation felt like a descent into a forgotten century. The modern world of steam engines and telegrams felt impossibly far away, a fragile skin stretched over an ancient, pulsing darkness. Eli Creed was a living bridge to that past, a man who lived in the shadow of the spire and understood the weight of the silence it imposed. He told us that the third relic, a lens of polished obsidian, had been lost during a storm 100 years ago, and since then, the light had become erratic, hungry, and prone to breathing in ways that terrified the village. The return of the lantern to Dagger Point was a completion of a cycle, a homecoming that the earth itself was responding to with tremors and violet glows. We left the old man by the harbor, his fingers resuming their rhythmic dance with the net. As we walked back toward the cliffs, the air felt heavier, charged with the information we had unearthed. The history of the widow's lantern was a story of a prison without bars, a legacy of light that was more burdensome than any shadow. Holmes looked toward the manor, his expression one of grim determination. He had the map now, not a map of paper and ink, but a map of legend and geological truth. The safe, structured world of our Baker Street sitting room was gone, replaced by the damp, salt-stained reality of a coastal mystery that was preparing to pull us under. The return to the safety of the house was a brief reprieve, a moment to gather our strength before the final immersion into the stone, where the secrets of the Marrow Line lay waiting in the rhythm of the deep. The descent into the bowels of Hemsley Manor began behind a heavy oak panel concealed within the servants' quarters, a door that had remained swollen and shut for decades, its surface etched with the silver scars of moisture and long-forgotten neglect. As Sherlock Holmes applied the steady pressure of a small iron crowbar, the wood groaned, a long, agonizing shriek that echoed through the empty stone hallways, like the cry of a disturbed sentinel waking from a century of slumber. Beyond the door lay a spiral staircase carved directly into the living limestone of the cliff, a narrow, damp throat of stone that seemed to swallow the light of our handheld lamps almost as soon as we stepped across the threshold. The air here was no longer the air of the living. It was heavy, motionless, and saturated with the ancient metallic tang of the deep earth and the scent of wet minerals. Every step we took was a rhythmic thud that vibrated upward from the soles of our boots, a slow measurement of our immersion into a world where the sun had never reached, and where time was marked only by the silent erosion of rock. The walls of the staircase were slick with a translucent moisture that shimmered like oil under the glow of my lantern, reflecting fragmented, ghostly versions of our own shadows against the jagged limestone. As we descended deeper into the throat of the cliff, the temperature began to drop with a steady, creeping persistence. A profound cold that seeped through my heavy wool coat and settled into the very marrow of my bones. Holmes moved with a predatory, silent grace, his lamp held low to illuminate the uneven treads, his keen eyes scanning the stone for marks of human passage or the subtle geometric grooves of ancient engineering. We were moving beneath the very foundations of the manor, passing through geological layers that had witnessed the rise and fall of forgotten empires long before the first stone of London was ever laid. The silence was absolute, a thick velvet curtain that muffled the sound of my own breathing, broken only by the rhythmic, distant cadence of water droplets falling into unseen pools. A slow, persistent dripping that acted as a geological clock, ticking away the centuries in the absolute dark. We finally reached a landing where the stairs opened into a vast natural cavern, a cathedral of shadow where the ceiling was lost in a charcoal mist of rising damp. The floor was covered in a fine white sand that felt like bone dust beneath our feet, and the walls were encrusted with jagged crystals of salt that sparkled like frozen stars in a subterranean sky. In the center of this chamber stood a structure that defied the rational logic of the Dorset coast, a small circular chapel of Byzantine design, built of dark, volcanic stone that must have been transported from across the distant seas at an immense cost of effort and blood. It sat there, an alien heart in a limestone body, surrounded by a ring of ancient salt-bleached timbers that resembled the weathered ribs of a shipwrecked leviathan. This was the sanctuary Eli Creed had whispered about, the hidden vault where the Merrill Line had guarded their impossible light against the prying eyes of the modern world. As we approached the chapel, I felt a low-frequency hum vibrating in the heavy air, a sound that was more a physical sensation than an auditory one, rattling the very teeth in my jaw with its rhythmic intensity. It was the song of the stone, a deep, pulsing resonance that seemed to synchronize with the slow beating of my own heart. Holmes stepped onto the threshold of the chapel, his lamp illuminating the floor, which was inlaid with a complex, swirling mosaic of a great vortex. In the center of the mosaic was a hollowed-out pedestal of polished obsidian, perfectly shaped to hold the widow's lantern we had carried all the way from the fog of Baker Street. The air here was charged with ozone, the sharp, metallic bitterness of a gathering storm trapped within the ribs of the earth. It was clear that this was not merely a place of quiet worship, but a piece of ancient, forgotten engineering, a focal point designed to harness the energy of the tides and the shifting magnetic fields of the deep ocean. I watched as Holmes knelt by the pedestal, his long, thin fingers tracing the grooves of the obsidian with a scholar's reverence and a hunter's precision. He was searching for the mechanism, the hidden truth behind the violet glow that defied the known laws of chemistry and light. The silence of the cavern seemed to lean in toward us, a heavy, expectant presence that watched our every move with 1,000 unseen eyes. I looked up at the vaulted ceiling and saw thousands of small, rhythmic points of pale light-not stars, but bioluminescent organisms that responded to our body heat, flickering in a slow, undulating wave that mimicked the breathing of a giant. We were inside a living machine, a subterranean lung that breathed in perfect time with the Atlantic surge just beyond the thick walls of rock. The feeling of being submerged, of being part of a vast, unthinking intelligence that had existed for eons, was overwhelming. pulling at the fragile edges of my reason. Holmes suddenly stood, his face illuminated from below by the pale light of his lamp, making his features appear as sharp and inscrutable as the stone itself. He pointed toward a narrow, jagged fissure in the back of the chapel, a passage that led even deeper toward the muffled, rhythmic roar of the subterranean sea. He told me in a whisper that the lantern was only the key, and that the lock lay further down, in the very roots of the widow's spire, where the salt met the fire of the earth. The descent had only just begun. We were leaving the realm of man-made structures and entering the raw, uncarved heart of the mystery. As we stepped into the fissure, the sound of the ocean grew from a distant thrum to a rhythmic, thunderous boom, a constant reminder that the water was only a thin wall of stone away, waiting to reclaim what was hers. The weight of the cliff above us felt immense, 1,000,000 tons of history and silence. Yet we pushed forward, driven by the need to see the source of the flame that never died. We were drifting deeper into the dark, and the safety of the world above was becoming a fading, impossible memory, as distant as a dream of a previous life. The narrow fissure opened into a vast oceanic cathedral of limestone and shadows, a place where the distinction between the solid earth and the fluid sea began to dissolve. We were standing on a natural gallery of rock, overlooking a subterranean lagoon that surged and receded with a rhythmic, thunderous power. The water here was not dark, but illuminated from beneath by a terrifying, shifting luminescence, a deep, bruised violet that pulsed in time with the very foundations of the cliff. In the center of this swirling vortex, standing upon a jagged plinth of stone that rose like a broken tooth from the foam, was the figure of Miles Varner. He looked less like a man and more like a fragment of the environment itself, his long coat damp with salt spray and his face caught in the flickering, unearthly glow of the lantern he held aloft. This was the slow culmination of his obsession, a quiet madness that had been brewing in the dark corners of the world for years. Varner did not move as we approached. He seemed to be listening to the water, his head tilted as if he could hear the specific frequency of the tide. When he finally turned to face us, his eyes reflected the violet pulse of the lagoon, two cold sparks of intelligence that had long since abandoned the warmth of human reason. He spoke, but his voice was nearly swallowed by the rhythmic boom of the waves. He did not speak of wealth or power, but of the light of the ancient, primordial energy that the Merrow family had imprisoned within their brass vessels. To him, the lantern was not a haunting, but a symphony of physics that the modern world was too timid to conduct. Sherlock Holmes stepped forward to the very edge of the gallery, his silhouette sharp and unwavering against the chaotic light. He did not draw a weapon. His strength was in the cold, methodical clarity of his presence. He began to dismantle Varner's grand design with the same rhythmic precision as a clockmaker. He spoke of the chemical composition of the limestone, the specific geological vents that allowed the seawater to interact with the mineral deposits, and the way the lantern's lens was designed to focus the resulting bioluminescence into a coherent beam. He stripped away the veneer of the supernatural, revealing the mechanical skeleton of the mystery. Yet, even as he spoke, the water below us began to rise, a slow and deliberate expansion that threatened to submerge the plinth and everyone upon it. The confrontation was not one of violence, but of competing wills. Varner believed he could command the rhythm of the deep, while Holmes knew that the earth only allows itself to be observed, never controlled. The violet light grew more intense, a blinding, throbbing aura that made the very air in the cavern feel heavy and thick with the scent of ozone. The sound of the sea became a deafening, rhythmic chant, a constant vibration that I felt in my marrow. Varner raised the lantern higher, his shadow stretching across the cavern walls like a monstrous, reaching hand. For a moment, it seemed as though the cavern would collapse under the weight of the sound and the light. as if the ancient stone had finally decided to silence the voices that dared to interrupt its long, cold sleep. But the ocean has a rhythm that no man can truly master. A sudden, massive surge of water, driven by a distant, lunar pull, swept through the sea tunnel with a roar that shook the entire cliffside. It was a cleansing wave, a wall of dark, salt-choked water that extinguished the violet glow in a single violent stroke. The lantern fell from Varner's grip, its brass frame striking the rock with a dull, final clang before it was swallowed by the churning foam. In the sudden, absolute darkness that followed, there was only the sound of the receding tide, a long drawn-out hiss of water over stone. When Holmes finally struck a match, the tiny, flickering flame revealed an empty plinth. The sea had reclaimed its secret, and Miles Varner had become a part of the history he had tried so desperately to rewrite. We stood in the silence of the aftermath, the rhythmic dripping of water from the ceiling, the only witness to the struggle. The weight of the mystery had been lifted, leaving behind only the cold, indifferent reality of the stone. Holmes looked down into the dark water, his expression unreadable in the frail light of the match. He had found the truth, but it was a truth that belonged to the shadows, a story that would never find its way into the official annals of the law. The journey into the heart of the Spire was over, and as we began the long, rhythmic climb back toward the surface, the memory of the violet light remained behind us, buried once more beneath the tide, waiting for the next century to breathe again. The return to Baker Street felt like a slow emergence from a deep and pressurized dream, a gradual reawakening to the world of gaslight, brick, and the familiar comforting gray of the London fog. We sat in our accustomed chairs, the fire in the hearth burning with a steady rhythmic crackle that seemed far more terrestrial than the violet pulses of the Dorset coast. Sherlock Holmes was enveloped in his dressing gown, his long, thin legs stretched toward the warmth, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as he watched the slow dance of shadows that mirrored the movement of his own thoughts. The silence between us was profound, a shared stillness that held the weight of everything we had seen beneath the cliffs, the ancient stone, the surging tide, and the light that was never meant for human eyes. It was a silence of completion, a quiet closure to a narrative that had finally been laid to rest. Across the room, the small trunk containing the remnants of our journey sat beneath the window, a silent witness to the impossibility of the case. Holmes had spent the better part of the evening documenting the physical properties of the cave system, yet I noticed that his notes remained curiously silent on the matter of Miles Varner's final moments. To the world, Varner would simply be a man who vanished into the salt spray of a winter storm, a casualty of his own obsession with the untamed edges of the map. The official records of Scotland Yard would never hold the truth of the lantern's heart, for it was a truth that defied the very language of the law. We were the only two men in the Empire who carried the memory of that bioluminescent vortex, a secret that bound us more closely than any shared danger ever could. I watched the steam rise from my tea, a slow and rhythmic spiral that vanished into the gloom of the ceiling. The scent of the city, a blend of coal smoke, wet pavement, and the distant, muffled bustle of commerce seemed like a fragile skin stretched over the primal reality we had uncovered. London was a city of order, of clocks and ledgers, yet I knew now that beneath the very stones of our civilization, there were currents of energy and history that moved to a tempo we could barely perceive. The widow, Catherine Merrill, had found her peace at last. She had moved to a quiet cottage inland, far from the sound of the surf, taking a new name and leaving the burden of the Spire to the wave. She was no longer a keeper of the seal, but a woman who could finally sleep without the fear of the violet pulse at her window. Holmes finally spoke, his voice a low, resonant murmur that broke the stillness without shattering it. He remarked that it is not always the discovery of the truth that matters most, but the silence that follows it. He had recognized that some mysteries are not puzzles to be solved, but forces to be respected and eventually left alone. The lantern, once a symbol of a sacred and terrifying legacy, was gone, reclaimed by the Atlantic and buried under 1,000 tons of shifting silt. Only the sea remembered the name of Miles Varner now, and only the stone understood the song it had been singing for eons. The case was closed, not with a flourish of handcuffs or a public trial, but with the quiet closing of a door and the steady rhythmic ticking of the mantel clock. As the fire began to dim, hollowing out into a core of glowing orange embers, I felt a sense of profound, weary tranquility. The weight of the Dorset cliffs had been replaced by the familiar gravity of our Baker Street sanctuary. We were safe, anchored in the present, while the mysteries of the deep retreated back into the shadows of the path. The world outside continued its frantic, noisy rotation. But here, in the heart of the mystery, there was only the warmth of the hearth and the long, graceful shadows that danced upon the walls. We had faced the darkness and returned, and as I finally leaned back into the depths of my chair, the memory of the salt spray and the violet light began to fade, drifting away like the smoke from Holmes's pipe into the quiet, starlit night. The embers in the fireplace have faded to a soft, pulsing crimson, a final rhythmic glow that mirrors the deep quiet of the London night. Beyond the heavy velvet drapes of Baker Street, the world has submerged itself in a sea of silver mist, turning the gas lamps into distant, flickering stars. There is no more mystery to solve, no more shadows to chase through the salt-sprayed caverns of the coast. The silence that fills this room is a vast and gentle tide, washing away the tension of the journey and leaving behind only the steady, comforting breath of a house at rest. You are anchored here, safe within the circle of this ancient sanctuary, where the echoes of the past drift like smoke into the high, dark corners of the ceiling. As the clock on the mantel marks the slow passage of the midnight hour, the boundaries of the waking world begin to soften and dissolve. The memory of the violet light and the roar of the Atlantic has become a distant, rhythmic hum, a lullaby of stone and water that pulls the mind toward a deeper, more profound stillness. Every shadow in this room is a familiar friend. Every creak of the floorboards, a gentle reminder of the enduring peace that follows the storm. Sherlock Holmes has vanished into the gloom of his armchair, a silent guardian of the night, while the city outside dreams of a tomorrow that is still far beyond the horizon. The fog presses against the glass with a soft, insistent touch, a velvet blanket that isolates us from the clamor of time and the weight of the everyday. Let the rhythm of your own breathing become the only sound in the universe, a steady and effortless rise and fall that matches the heartbeat of the sleeping city. There is nothing left to do, nowhere left to go, but to drift further into the gray, silken spaces of the mind where stories end and dreams begin. The lantern has been returned to the deep. The widow has found her silence, and the great detective has closed his eyes to the light. We are all part of the same long unfolding narrative, a history of shadows and light that eventually fades into the perfect, unblemished dark. The warmth of the hearth lingers in the air like a final caress, grounding the spirit as the imagination takes flight into the vast, quiet reaches of the unknown. The world is still, the fire is low, and the journey is complete. Through the haze of this deepening tranquility, the image of the Dorset cliffs becomes a faint, translucent memory, sinking slowly beneath the waves of a dreamless sleep. There is only the peace of the present moment, the heavy comfort of the blankets, and the soft, repetitive sigh of the wind in the chimney. You are drifting now, moving with the slow, inevitable grace of the tide as it pulls away from the shore, leaving the solid earth behind for the infinite, silent reaches of the deep. Sleep now, for the secrets of the widow's lantern are buried deep beneath the silt. and time, and the only light that remains is the soft, internal glow of a mind at rest. Well, the night is long, the sanctuary is secure, and the silence is absolute. Good night, and may your dreams be as vast and as peaceful as the sea,